Known as the first mountain man, John Coulter came west as a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. They braved the Great Missouri River, traveled the plains, and crossed the Rocky Mountains, eventually finding the Pacific Ocean. On the return trip, Coulter turned back west again, this time with 2 fur trappers, and headed to the beaver-rich Yellowstone River. He was the first white man to see such sights as present-day Yellowstone National Park, Pierre's Hole in Idaho, the Teton mountain range, and to extensively explore the Three Forks region of present-day Montana. This OG mountain man survived many violent encounters with warlike tribes, at one point even forced to run for his life, naked, while hundreds of warriors chased after him. So without further ado, let's dive deep into the man, the myth, the legend, John Coulter. Born in Virginia, most likely in 1774, the Coulter family would move to Kentucky a few years later around 1780. I wasn't able to find out a whole bunch of information on John Coulter prior to the Lewis and Clark expedition, or his entire life actually, but there were sources that said he may have served in the militia under Simon Kenton. And Kenton, who I previously had never heard of, was somewhat of a badass himself. He was a frontiersman, a soldier, and he participated in not only the Revolutionary War, but the Northwest Indian War and the War of 1812. Interesting fact, the first ever written record of John Coulter comes from a journal entry by Captain Clark on October 30th, 1803, where he notes that Coulter killed a deer and a turkey. John signed up for the Corps of Discovery shortly before that on October 15th, 1803. He would have been around the age of 29 at this time, and we also know that he was 5 foot 10 inches, making him 2 inches taller than the average height of an American man at that time, which was 5 foot 8 inches tall. So there you go. So what the hell was the Corps of Discovery? You've probably heard it referred to as the Lewis and Clark expedition, and this is easily one of my top favorite American history topics of all time. Long story short, the United States bought the French-owned Louisiana Territory from Napoleon in the year 1800 in what would come to be known as the Louisiana Purchase. Now, I know what you're thinking. Big fucking deal. What's so great about Louisiana? I'll tell you what, asshole. Cajun food, Cajun accents, casinos, and shooting alligators in the head. Shoot him! Shoot him! No, seriously though, in all actuality, the Louisiana Territory was nowhere near as small as the present-day state of Louisiana is. It took up a huge chunk of the middle of North America. It included the entire states of Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota, as well as portions of Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Minnesota, Montana, Wyoming, and even extended into present-day Canada. And one of the purposes of the Lewis and Clark expedition was to find out just what the hell the United States government had purchased. In the year 1800, the American people literally knew next to nothing about the land that they had just purchased, other than it was likely full of hostile warring tribes. To give you an idea of how remote the area was, how unknown it was, just check out a map of the United States. Find St. Louis, Missouri. Got it? Okay, everything west of there is unexplored wilderness, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. You had a few Mexican missions in Texas and California. There were some French trappers that would venture down from Canada into, the Dakotas to trade for furs with the natives. And sometimes Russian and British ships would land on the west coast of Oregon and Washington and trade as well. But that's fucking it. Completely unknown territory. Unknown to everybody, that is, but the many thousands and thousands of Native Americans that populated the region. So when I say unknown, or so-and-so discovered something, or so-and-so was the first white person to see such and such, I'm fully aware that this area had been populated for thousands of years. What I'm talking about in this particular podcast episode is the, quote, civilized Western world discovering something for the first time. The expedition wasn't just tasked with exploring this vast wilderness, but more specifically, trying to find a water connection, linked by a low portage across the mountains that would lead to the Pacific. Basically just an all-water trade route that would connect the United States to the West Coast, which, as the Corps of Discovery would find out, did not exist. The trade route, that is. The West Coast did exist. It's a very real thing. The expedition were to take samples and identify any potentially unknown to science plants and animals, as well as chart out and map the journey, taking readings from sextants and observing the stars. They were also to make trade relations with the natives. They not only had tons of trade goods with them, but medals to give various chiefs from the, quote, Great Father, meaning President Thomas Jefferson. They also were to show off a little military might, bringing with them a blunderbuss, a cannon, and an air rifle, which they'd always take out and demonstrate for the natives. I never understood the whole air rifle thing, okay, bro, you got a BB gun? Oh, shit. So I Googled it. If you're any type of gun nut or just into firearms history, you definitely want to check this one out. The gun in question was the Girandoni, Girandoni, air rifle, designed around 1779, and actually used in combat by the Austrian army. Yes, combat. This ain't your daddy's Red Ryder BB gun. The Girondoni shot a 46 or a 51 caliber ball at 500 feet per second and was deadly up to 150 yards. What made it really cool and why I think they demonstrated it to the American Indians was that it was very quiet. You could do a search on YouTube and find videos of people shooting them, and it really does sound like a modern day BB gun. But it also held 20 of these powerful caliber balls. Once loaded and charged with air, all you had to do was cock it, which added a ball to the chamber, and fire. 20 times. It was essentially a repeating rifle, and deadly effective over 100 yards. The natives at this time only knew the old flintlock rifles, which could only shoot once before having to add another ball and powder and all that stuff, so this was not only a show of power, but also a show of technological advancements and superiority. They wanted to show the natives that they were much more advanced than they were. And also probably a real source of defense if the men of the expedition were overran. At least for one time. While cool, this rifle was extremely impractical. The butt of the rifle was basically hollowed out of cast iron, and that's where the air reservoir was held. And once the air was out, you had to pump it something like 1,500 times to be able to shoot again. And it was delicate. If you banged the butt around, it could cause a leak, thus rendering it useless. So going forward, like I said, much of the West was unknown, and there were plenty of rumors of mysterious things out there. President Jefferson himself believed that woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, and other prehistoric creatures could be roaming along the upper Missouri. He thought that somewhere out there was a great white mountain made from salt. The captains were also tasked to learn as much as they could of the languages of the natives that they would encounter. There were still some thoughts that a lost tribe of Israel or even a tribe of Welshmen could be living out west. The expedition consisted of Lewis and Clark, 22 enlisted men, one of whom was John Coulter, and 3 sergeants. Clark's slave York, a man named Drillard, and Lewis's dog Seaman would round out the ranks. Yes, Lewis's dog was named Seaman. That's S-E-A-M-E-N, okay? Not S-E-M-E-N. So get your mind out of the gutter. What are you, in the 5th grade or something? Just so we're clear, Lewis didn't name his dog after the devil's batter that comes out of your wee-wee when you're having sexy time. So let's grow up, people. Also, for the trip upriver to Fort Mandan, the Corps would employ a number of French engages. These weren't official members of the expedition, they were just hired hands to help them force the killboat up the river. Once they reached Fort Mandan, these men were sent back to St. Louis. So yeah, the men of the Corps Discovery weren't just any random volunteers. As a matter of fact, the captains were inundated with people who wanted to join, so they were able to pick the cream of the crop. One of the advertisements they put out stated they were looking for good hunters, stout, healthy, unmarried men accustomed to the woods and capable of bearing bodily fatigue in a pretty considerable degree. John Coulter definitely fit the bill. He signed on as private for $5 a month with the possibility of a land grant once the expedition was over. According to my super duper inflation calculator, that's only $100 a month, or $1,200 a year. Not a whole lot of money to be going into an unknown, potentially dangerous wilderness. But I don't really think money is what motivated these men. It was an adventure they were after, and it was most definitely an adventure they would find. The expedition made their final preparations outside of St. Louis, Missouri, and Coulter would get into a little bit of trouble here during this time. Both Lewis and Clark left the men under the charge of Sergeant Ordway, and there wasn't a whole lot of work to be done by the men at this point. But still, they weren't allowed to leave the camp unless for hunting purposes. Also, no whiskey over the allotted daily ration. This didn't sit too well for some of the men, Coulter among them. He and 3 other men went, air quotes, hunting. At least that's what they claimed. What they actually did was visit a nearby whiskey hole and get a nice drunk on. As punishment under Lewis's orders via letter, the men were confined to quarters for 10 days. Their daily whiskey ration, by the way, was 1 gill, and a gill is about 4 ounces. And 4 ounces of whiskey is about the equivalent of 4 beers. For most people, this raises the blood alcohol limit to 0.1%. In my state, Texas, that's over the legal limit, and you will definitely get a DWI. So that happened in early March, and by the end of the month, Coulter once again found himself in trouble. The men evidently still had a little bit too much free time on their hands, and we all know that idle hands are the devil's workshop. They weren't camped very far from, like I said, St. Louis, a bustling settlement at the time, but they still weren't allowed to visit it. You know, they didn't get a chance to mingle with the ladies, they weren't allowed any more than that 1 gill of whiskey a day, and now that most of the work was done, all they had to do was practice their drills, which they fucking hated, and target practice with their rifles, which they loved, but they were only allowed to do that once a day. The men began fighting amongst themselves, as tends to happen when guys get bored, especially with a bunch of alpha-type males like these guys. And then they started bucking orders from Sergeant Ordway again. Coulter not only disobeyed orders, but escalated things to the point of him loading his rifle and threatening to shoot the sergeant. To quote Stephen Ambrose in Undaunted Courage, "These young heroes were in great shape, strong as bulls, eager to get going, full of energy and testosterone, and bored. So they fought and drank and fought." Fighting is one thing, shit happens, you know, sometimes it's just how guys work stuff out. When you're around a group of guys like this, people are going to push each other's buttons, but to threaten to shoot an NCO, that's obviously a big no-no. Coulter was put on trial for mutiny, he repented, and he asked for forgiveness, and it was granted. He received no punishment, at least none that was recorded, and was able to keep his spot on the expedition. I can't help but think there's probably more to it than that. John Coulter, as you'll find out on this episode, was a very capable, steady man. He was courageous, great tracker, great hunter, all that good stuff. And he did end up proving invaluable for the expedition. But still, man, you're about to embark on a trip into dangerous, unknown territory for the next 2 years. I would think that discipline would have to be like a big deal. Especially if you have men not want to take orders from a man, Sergeant Ordway, who'd be in charge of them the entire time. Was the fault in Ordway? Was he being too much of a strict, like by-the-book lifer NCO type? Maybe, but by all accounts, his service in the Corps of Discovery was exceptional as well. So I don't know. There were severe punishments meted out to some of the men later on during the expedition for what I think are less serious crimes than threatening to shoot your damn sergeant. So I don't know. Either way, he got off scot-free. The party would finally push out into the great unknown on May 14th, 1804. And here's just a couple of examples of how reliable Coulter was as recorded in the journals of Lewis and Clark and further recorded by Stephen Ambrose. While ascending the Missouri River, Coulter's skills at hunting were being utilized more and more often. He was sent after a missing man a couple of times, not only indicating their faith in him being alone in hostile territory, but his ability to not get himself lost as well, being able to navigate on foot upriver and find the boat. Coulter would indeed be one of the primary hunters for the expedition. Later on, when trying to find a pass over the Rocky Mountains, Coulter, while hunting, met with 4 members of the Nez Perce tribe who actually lived on the western side of the Rockies, thus proving that the mountains could be crossed and reporting this info back to Captain Lewis. In one incident, returning east to the Rockies from the west coast, Coulter was surrounded by a large group of natives who attempted to steal his tomahawk. They were unsuccessful. You'll see this with Coulter more than a few times. He'll be outnumbered, the natives will crowd around trying to forcibly take his shit or that of his companions, and he won't back down. He'll forcibly take his possessions back. The mentality being, if you give an inch, you better be prepared to give a damn mile. Let them take your tomahawk, and the next thing you know, they'll take half your gear, and maybe your fucking scalp with it. Stepping away from Coulter for a moment, let's go back to Lewis and Clark, just because the expedition was a really important milestone in his life and a huge part of his story. The expedition would last almost 3 years. The men departed on keel boats up the Missouri River against the current. This was before steam-powered boats were invented, so they basically had to push and pull their way upriver. Using long poles, they'd shove against the floor of the river, just pushing their vessel forward. Also pulling with ropes. It was extremely hard labor. They narrowly made it past the Great Sioux Nation, were able to winter with the Mandan that first winter of 1804 in present-day North Dakota. While there, they hired a French-Canadian named Charbonneau to come along as a translator, along with his very pregnant 14-year-old wife, because times really were different in 1804. The wife, Sacagawea, was a member of the Shoshone Tribe, and much like Coulter, this young lady would also prove invaluable to the expedition. She'd also have her baby right before departing from the Mandan village. The crew nicknamed the baby Pomp, and little Pomp also went along on the trip as well. After winter, the men pressed west, going through the Missouri Breaks area of the upper Missouri and present-day Montana. This area of the upper plains was definitely a hunter's paradise, and the expedition ate off the fat of the land, consuming as much as 9 pounds of meat per day per person. Antelope, bison, elk, they dined on it all, along with any fruits, berries, stuff like that they could find along the way. And this is another way that Sacagawea proved her value. Able to walk the shore and identify and gather all kinds of tasty treats, along with other medicinal herbs and plants that could be used for healing purposes. Once reaching the headwaters of the upper Missouri and finding out that there was not an all-water course to the Pacific, they took off on foot in hopes of finding a friendly tribe that they could trade for horses with. And they lucked out big time on this. Not only did they find a tribe willing to trade, but it was also a band of Shoshone. And not just any band, the exact same band that Sacagawea was from, having been kidnapped years earlier. And her brother was now the chief. This helped the expedition out immensely in obtaining horses. I mean, there's a chance that if Sacagawea wasn't along for the journey, it might not have even been completed. They were able to get a Shoshone guide to lead them through the pass of the Rocky Mountains, crossing the Continental Divide. Once over the mountains, the expedition continued west, crossing the Bitterroot Mountains and then taking canoes down the Columbia River. They finally saw the Great Pacific Ocean in November of 1805. And that's also where they spent the winter of 05 and 06 in the area of present-day Astoria, Oregon, hunting and doing a lot of trading with the local tribes. And fucking. A lot of fucking. I forgot to mention that. These men literally fornicated their way west, all the way from the Mandans in North Dakota to the coastal Clatsop and Chinook tribes in northwestern Oregon. You know, for the men of the expedition, it was just sex, but for the tribes they were doing the nasty with, it was viewed as an exchange of power and skill, with the wife acting as kind of a conduit. Remember how on the Quanah Parker episode I talked about big medicine, how in some ways it was sort of like good luck or even like good magic? This was the train of thought going on here. If you had sex with one of the Native American women, then that woman had sex with her husband. The thought was that your power or your medicine would be transferred to pass on that ability to be good hunters, be good providers. And here you have this new group of people, the men of the expedition, who are seen as being very special, as having, quote, big medicine. With all their fancy guns and metal tools, this was all advanced technology to the natives, and they wanted some of that power. And they were really intrigued with Clark's slave York. They'd never seen a black man before, and York was a big dude. So his large physique and dark skin suggested very powerful medicine. One Arikara warrior who had York sleep with his wife actually stood guard outside the lodge just to keep the couple from being interrupted. Not all encounters went so smoothly. In November of 1804, Sergeant John Ordway, remember him? He got frisky with a Native American woman without her husband's consent. And when the man came across Ordway and his wife, the husband stabbed her several times. Shit. Captain Clark immediately ordered the sergeant to present the man with trinkets and told the couple to make up. No idea how the woman fared. During the long winter stay with the Mandan in 1805, Clark would describe what was called the buffalo dance. An interesting ritual where once again the idea of power being transferred through sex was practiced. Basically, the old men would arrange themselves in a circle and start smoking their pipes, and the young men would have their wives approach the older gentlemen and beg them to, do the dirty. Clark said, quote, "We sent a man to this medicine dance last night. They gave him 4 girls. Damn, 4 girls. I'm sure at this point that $5 a month wasn't looking so bad after all. Talk about employee benefits. Yeah, so here's the thing. We got a tight budget. I can only pay you minimum wage. We don't offer 401k. We don't have insurance. But hear me out. What we can do is offer you a 4-way with exotic women a couple times a week." It wasn't all sunshine and orgy rainbows, though. An outbreak of venereal disease put a timeout on the intercultural exchanges between the North Dakota tribes and the explorers for a good minute. After the men re-embarked towards the west in April of 1805, they had more encounters. The Shoshones were accommodating, but they'd get a little butthurt if their women got rejected. And the Pacific Northwest, the Clatsop and Chinook, used sex as a trade item. Bartering became so frequent that Lewis warned his crew to hold off because they were running short of necessary provisions. They were literally screwing themselves into the poorhouse. But beyond these sexual adventures, the Corps of Discovery may have left some legacies on the trail as well. Some baby legacies, if you know what I mean. Both Captains Lewis and Clark were rumored to have left children behind, Clark having supposedly impregnated a Nez Perce lady, and Lewis a Brule Sioux maiden. Those are just rumors. What's fact is that the men were very amorous with the ladies, and this is according to Captain Lewis's journal. He never records any instance of he and Clark partaking, but they were gone for a long time, the women were available, and I imagine some would have been very beautiful, so I doubt they abstained. Likely as officers and gentlemen, they wouldn't want their carnal natures to be public knowledge. I didn't read any account of John Coulter having any romantic ventures with the native ladies, but I'm sure he did. 3 years is a long time to be away from home. He was single. He was in the prime of his life. Why wouldn't he? Speaking of venereal diseases, he probably got a few of those as well. There weren't any gynecologists out west, or condoms for that matter. While staying with the Shoshone, Captain Lewis made inquiries as to the presence of STDs among them. He learned that it was a problem, but he couldn't figure out the remedy. He said they most surely died with its effects. He then goes on to say, quote, "This seems a strong proof that these disorders, both gonorrhea and syphilis, are native disorders of America." But that's not really that great a proof. The Shoshone, they already suffered from smallpox, which the Europeans definitely brought over. And even though these were the first whites that the tribe had seen, they surely would have slept or traded with other tribes who did the same with others who had contacts with Europeans. So I'm not really sure what syphilis is, even after I Googled it, because I'm too stupid to understand all the medical jargon. It looks like it's treatable, however. But if gone untreated, it can result in a person going insane. The great philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche was said to have gone mad with syphilis. Interestingly enough, Captain Lewis, after the Lewis and Clark expedition, would himself go insane, eventually committing suicide. And as far as the men of the expedition were concerned, they were treated with mercury to get rid of these infections. They used mercury to treat everything. What they didn't know, and what we definitely know now, is that mercury is toxic as hell. One source I found lists the symptoms of mercury poison as chest pains, heart and lung problems, coughing, tremors, violent muscle spasms, psychotic reactions, delirium, hallucination, fun stuff. But it did seem to help cure some of the STDs, so there you go. A quick note on all this lovemaking. I hope I'm not giving off the impression that all, or even most, Native American women were sexually loose and just throwing themselves on anybody and everybody. First of all, as I mentioned before, it was mostly a transaction. They gave sex, and in return, they received beads and trinkets and other trade goods. Or they received nothing because their husbands forced them to have sex with the men of the expedition in hopes of attaining big medicine. We don't have any records of what these women thought of the whole deal, but I have to assume that some enjoyed it, but probably the vast majority did not. Also, we're dealing with a few select tribes in this episode. There's like 500-something Native American tribes in the United States at present time. Who the hell knows how many existed during the time of the Lewis and Clark expedition? These tribes all had unique cultures, religions, ceremonies, you name it. There was as much difference between, let's say, the Iroquois in the eastern United States and the Klamath tribe in northern California as there is between a present-day Wall Street banker and a Texas oil field worker. Basically, what I'm trying to say is chastity and sexuality would have varied greatly amongst these tribes. And also, the European Puritan mindset didn't exist in America prior to its colonization. And what's more, these tribes native to the New World, they didn't have to deal with hundreds and hundreds of years of the church just suppressing sexuality as the Europeans did. Moving forward. After wintering on the West Coast, the expedition headed back east, splitting forces and doing more exploring. They got into a touchy situation with some members of the Blackfeet Nation that resulted in the death of 2 Blackfeet, something that would cause a decades-long animosity with the tribe and future Americans that would visit this area. They all got sick and almost starved on the return crossing of the Rocky Mountains, living off roots, dried fish, and dog meat that they traded for from the Nez Perce. Yes, dog meat. What? You've never been hungry? Go without food for a few days and tell me a nice little plump rat terrier wouldn't be delicious. Or maybe even a damn shih tzu. I don't know. But I know they ate it, and they liked it. Despite illness, STDs, and starving times, the men pressed on, reached the Missouri, and headed back east, now going with the flow of the river to the Mandan village where they wintered 2 years prior. Now, let's break for a word from our sponsors. This episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast is brought to you by the John Coulter 50-Cent Shave Club. For just 50 cents a month, they'll ship you their patented John Coulter safety razor straight to your door. But Josh, why is it so cheap? How could they possibly make any sort of profit selling a razor for just 50 cents? I'll tell you why. It doesn't actually come with a real razor. It's just shaped like a razor and carved out of 100% birch bark tree. Because when you've got as much testosterone coursing through your veins as John Coulter did, it's literally impossible to shave. Just suck it up and let that luscious man beard flow. That's John Coulter's 50-Cent Shave Club. It's the razor that brings all the beavers to the yard, if you know what I mean. Back to the podcast. The Corps of Discovery was a success, and in no small part due to men like John Coulter. They met their objective of reaching the Pacific, mapping and establishing their presence for a legal claim to the land. They established diplomatic relations and trade with at least 24 indigenous nations and encountering some 70 different tribes. And while they didn't find a continuous waterway to the Pacific, they were able to locate an Indian trail that led from the upper end of the Missouri River to the Columbia River, which did run to the Pacific. They gained information about the natural habitat, flora, and fauna, bringing back various plant, seed, and mineral specimens. They were able to accurately describe over 200 new plant and animal species. They mapped out the topography. They designated the location of mountain ranges, rivers, and many native tribes during the course of their journey. They also learned and recorded much about the customs and languages of the Native Americans they encountered, bringing back many of their artifacts, including bows and arrows, clothing, and ceremonial garb. They left the Mandan village and returned to St. Louis on September 23, 1806, having been gone for 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days. But not with John Coulter. Almost back to the Mandan village, they encountered 2 white men coming up the river. Joseph Dickinson of Illinois and Forrest Hancock of Missouri. They were aspiring fur trappers and headed to the beaver-rich Yellowstone River. And this was pretty interesting because these 2 men started off their journey in Iowa in August of 1804, meaning that the Lewis and Clark expedition was only 3 months ahead of private trappers exploring the Louisiana Territory. As Ambrose notes in Undaunted Courage, quote, Dickinson and Hancock were the cutting edge of what might be called the fur rush. It couldn't be taken for granted that there would be many others coming close behind them. However much Jefferson might want to reserve the upper Louisiana for displaced Indians from the east of the Mississippi, no power on earth, and certainly no laws written in Washington, could stop the American frontiersmen. They were lured up the Missouri River by the spirit of endurance, by a cockiness and bravado that were not entirely without foundation, by a love of the wilderness, and by greed. Powerful motives in young men that cannot be denied. Well said. And come they would. Dickinson and Hancock must have been impressed by Coulter, so they asked if he'd come along with them to the Yellowstone, and he agreed. That's the crazy part. He'd been away from civilization for over 2 years now, and here he was ready to turn back and head into the vast wilderness once again. He'd been to the West Coast and back, crossed the Rockies twice and the Great Plains twice, encountered numerous tribes, some not so friendly, and he was still willing to do it again. Why? Was it a love of the wilderness? Was it that sense of adventure? Was it the money aspect, having already seen firsthand just how rich the region was in fur, and knowing how much the markets are starving for that fur back east? I don't know. Nobody knows. But the captains agreed to release him from his service early, and he took off west again. He would have been around 32 years old at this time. The trio would actually split up not long after they partnered up. And we also don't know why this happened. What we do know is that a French-Canadian trader did see Dickinson and Hancock traveling separately down the Missouri River a year later without John Coulter. I've read some accounts that said the men may have gotten into an argument and had some sort of falling out, but I don't know. Basically, they broke up. And Coulter started a long journey home again, down the Missouri, and once again, he turned around. This time being persuaded by a man named Manuel Lisa to head back west again as a free trapper, as did several other Lewis and Clark veterans. Lisa was one of the early pioneers of the fur trade, employing numerous men over the years to go west and trap and trade for furs. Henry Marie Brackenridge states that Lisa met Coulter at the mouth of the Platte River and convinced him once again to go back up the river and trap fur. This was in June of 1807. Coulter at this point hasn't seen civilization in over 3 years. They reached the mouth of the Bighorn in November, built a fort, and then Coulter was dispatched by Lisa to bring in local Native American tribes to trade at the fort. And the tribe that Coulter was tasked with making contact with were the Crow. Coulter took a 30-pound pack, his gun, and traveled 500 miles to visit the Crow Nation. I wish I knew exactly what was in his pack. He would have definitely had a flint and steel striker to start a fire with, a large butcher knife and a tomahawk. He had his shot pouch with balls for his rifle, a powder horn, a heavy wool blanket for warmth, probably several extra moccasins, probably an awl or some type of large needle to repair his clothing with. And at this time, he would be dressed exactly like an American Indian. Whatever white people clothing he wore when he left St. Louis years earlier would have been long gone before the Lewis and Clark expedition was even over. He would now be clad completely in buckskin. And I'm sure there were a lot of trade items as well in the pack, just a way to entice the Crow to come to Lisa's fort. It was also around this time that John Coulter entered what's now Yellowstone National Park, making him the first white man to have ever seen it, as well as crossing the Teton mountain range and discovering Pierre's Hole in Idaho. He also discovered something called Coulter's Hell just west of present-day Cody, Wyoming. Historian Washington Irving said this about Coulter's Hell. A volcanic tract is found on the Stinking River, one of the tributaries of the Bighorn, which takes its unhappy name from the odor derived from sulfurous springs and streams. It was discovered by Coulter, a hunter belonging to the Lewis and Clark's exploring party who came upon it in the course of his lonely wanderings, and gave such an account of its pervading smell of brimstone that it received and has ever since retained among the trappers the name of Coulter's Hell. And it's not actually volcanic, but thermal, and the Stinking River is now known as the Shoshone River. This is some beautiful country. Yellowstone Park, obviously. 4-something million tourists a year can't be wrong. The Wind River, the Tetons, Pierre's Hole. Imagine being able to see this country when it was in its most pristine state. No roads, no buildings, no pollution, no planes flying overhead, just pure nature. If you're not big on geography, all these places I'm talking about are in Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. Montana is literally known as God's country. Man, I want to go there so bad. One day. Definitely one day. I mentioned the Grand Teton Mountains earlier that Coulter crossed over. Nowadays, you have Grand Teton National Park just south of Yellowstone National Park, and much like Yellowstone, it's gorgeous and a huge tourist attraction, visited by millions a year. But I wonder how many of those tourists actually know how the park got its name. I promise I'm not making this up, but the Grand Teton Mountain Range literally means big titties or nipples in French. Early French trappers named the range Les Trois Tetons, which literally translates to the 3 nipples. But Tetons in this case being slang for just a boobie in general, after the distinct breast-like shapes of its peaks, from which the modern name, Grand Tetons, is derived. Coulter did indeed make contact with the Crow Nation, and while traveling with them and returning to the fort, they were attacked by a large war party of Blackfeet, and during the battle, Coulter was wounded in the leg. This wouldn't be Coulter's last run-in with the Blackfeet, not by a long shot. The Blackfeet, if you remember, was the tribe that Lewis had the fight with on the return trip across the Rockies. Now, the Blackfeet Nation were a powerhouse on the plains during this time. Their range was all the way from Canada down to Montana. A very warlike people, the Blackfeet would continue to clash with the American fur trappers well into the mid-19th century. A few months after the fight with the Blackfeet, Coulter went off trapping with another veteran of the Lewis and Clark expedition, John Potts, somewhere near the Jefferson River in present-day Montana, probably not too far from Bozeman. Potts, by the way, had traveled back to St. Louis with the expedition. He had returned to civilization, but he didn't stay long. He didn't even collect the land grant awarded to him. Why was this? What was it about those wild lands that took men away from so-called civilization into the heart of danger? I know I asked this before, but I'm going to go more in depth on this later. Let's just say I don't believe it was purely motivated by money. So let's set the scene. Coulter and Potts were out trapping beaver. Sweet, sweet beaver. The process involved here is basically just wading out to the cold river where you'd bait the trap with something called beaver castor. Just a pungent odor you distract from a beaver's gland. You take a stake and place it in the ring on a long chain connected to the trap, then drive it deep into the water, hoping to entice a wily beaver. You'd actually have several traps as well, or a string of traps. You weren't just putting one out in one spot, but multiple traps spread around. And I hope to God no modern-day trapper is listening to this, because I have an extremely crude idea of how the whole process works, and I probably just totally butchered it. But yeah, so that's what Coulter and Potts were up to on this particular morning. And since they were deep in the heart of Blackfeet country, they took precautions. They'd set the traps at night, collect the beaver early in the morning, and just lay low during the day. They were paddling their canoe down a creek that morning to check the traps when they started hearing sort of a trampling sound coming from the shore. Coulter immediately suspected it to be Blackfeet and wanted to go back to camp, but Potts wanted to keep going, saying it was probably just a buffalo making the noise. So instead of turning back, they pressed on. Not that it would have mattered either way. Moments later, the two men were surrounded on both banks of the river by hundreds of warriors, and the Blackfeet were signing for them to come to shore. So they did. What else can you do? Maybe they'd be able to talk their way out of this mess, something. And Coulter was probably nervous as hell, wondering if any of these Blackfeet had been present when he fought them with the crow, and if so, would they recognize him? Once they pulled into shore, one of the warriors grabbed Potts' rifle, and Coulter immediately wrestled away and handed it back to Potts. Highly outnumbered, if shit hits the fan, at least with a rifle you could go down fighting. And with many of these warrior societies, you had to maintain a strong face, even if it's a facade. Don't show any weakness. And for whatever reason, possibly to avoid the inevitable torture that would come, as soon as Coulter gave Potts his rifle back, Potts pointed at a warrior and shot him dead, thus instantly becoming a fucking pincushion. He was riddled with arrows. He was mutilated. One source I read said, and I don't know how accurate this is, so keep that in mind, the source said that Potts' various body parts were cut off and thrown at Coulter, who by now had been stripped of all of his clothing. One Blackfoot woman threw Potts' severed penis at Coulter, striking him in the face with it. And then the Blackfeet began to talk about how they would kill Coulter. At first, they were going to put him up as a target to be shot at, but the chief, wanting to make it a little bit more fun, asked Coulter if he could run fast. Coulter either understood enough of their language from his time with the Crow, or they were communicating in the universal sign language of the Plains, something Coulter would have been fluent in. Either way, Coulter told a fib and said that he was a very slow runner, although he was said to have been one of the swiftest runners amongst the hunters. The chief then took him out on a prairie a few hundred yards and turned him loose to run for his life. It's basically a game. You run for it, we'll give you a head start, and then we're going to chase you down and kill you. He walked for some ways, knowing that as soon as he started running, they'd give chase, which is exactly what they did. As soon as he picked up his pace, the Blackfeet gave their war cry and started after him. Coulter ran straight across an open plain toward the Jefferson River 6 miles away. On bare feet, the sagebrush and thorns ripped his feet to shreds. But he kept running. He was literally running for his life. He ran so hard and so fast, before long his nose started bleeding. Eventually, looking over his shoulder, he saw that he had outrun all of the warriors except for one. He was only a few hundred yards behind Coulter, carrying a spear and quickly gaining on the mountain man. Now, only a mile away from the river, Coulter actually could hear the warrior behind him. Looking over his shoulder again, he saw that the man was only 20 yards away. Holy shit. Coulter then did something that saved his life. He stopped immediately, spun around, and spread out his arms, startling the ever-loving shit out of this Blackfeet warrior. Can you imagine chasing after some unarmed guy, having the upper hand? You're thinking about how much pussy you're going to get after you scalp this dude, and all of a sudden a crazed, naked, bearded white man whirls around and faces you, his upper body drenched with the blood that had been gushing out of his nose? Well, it did startle this warrior. He tripped, fell down, and broke his spear. Coulter lunged, grabbing the pointed end of the spear and driving it into the warrior, killing him. Knowing he had no time to spare, Coulter raced to the river and plunged into its icy depths. He saw a large pile of driftwood in the middle of the river and was able to get underneath it and conceal himself with about just enough room to keep his head out of the water. I was curious about the whole nose bleeding thing and Googled it, and sure enough, according to livestrong.com, when exercising or running for your fucking life, your heart pumps blood throughout your body at a greater rate as your muscles demand extra oxygen. Some of that blood flows through the little capillaries inside the nose itself, and I guess when the tiny blood vessels in the soft internal lining of your nose rupture, blah, 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 medical jargon that I don't understand. Anyway, he got a fucking nosebleed. It's science. Look it up. By this time, the Blackfeet had found their dead friend and were thrashing up and down the banks of the river trying to find Coulter. For hours. He couldn't leave from underneath this pile of wood or he'd be discovered. At one point, he was able to hoist his body up and kind of out of the water, but he still wasn't able to leave the shelter until the Blackfeet went away. And that didn't happen until nightfall. Can you imagine the shrinkage that was going on in that cold water? How embarrassing would it be if he got caught and they just all made jokes about his tiny, shriveled up little ween before they killed and mutilated him? But they didn't. He left the crude shelter under the cover of darkness, swam down the river a long distance before stepping on the bank. He didn't want to chance the Blackfeet finding his tracks. He was now alone in the wilderness, naked, without a weapon, his feet torn to pieces. Cold as fuck, no way to start a fire, no way to hunt for food. He was hundreds of miles from the nearest trading post in a country full of hostile warriors. But Coulter was a survivor. He had grit. A week later, he finally reached Lisa's Fort, starving, feet tattered, baked by the sun, unrecognizable, but alive. There's an old movie called The Mountain Men starring Charlton Heston, and there's a scene where he's made to run for his life and take shelter in some driftwood. If you're curious, you can watch the scene on YouTube, and it was most definitely inspired by the real-life John Coulter. Also, not a bad movie, by the way. That winter, Coulter would return to the sites that Potts was killed in so he could retrieve his traps. Balls on this guy. I mean, I guess traps don't grow on trees. But guess what happened? He was attacked by the Blackfeet again. The ever-grizzled Coulter continued the life of the mountain man trapper. He signed on with the Missouri Fur Company in 1810 and went back again to the Three Forks area of present-day Montana, the same place where he already had 2 violent encounters with the Blackfeet. And don't you know it, he was once again attacked. Narrowly escaping death, he finally had enough. Coulter claimed that if God would just forgive him, he'd give up the damn mountains for good, and true to his word, he did just that. Returning to St. Louis by the end of 1810, he had been away from civilization for almost 6 years, and definitely not the same man he was before. According to a friend who knew him at the time, he, quote, wore an open, pleasing countenance of the Daniel Boone stamp. Nature had formed him, like Boone, for hardy endurance of fatigue, privation, and perils. The Boone they're referring to here is the famed frontiersman Daniel Boone. Basically just saying that he came back to civilization a bad motherfucker. Someone who's seen some shit and survived by his own wits and determination. He met with William Clark and gave him lots of valuable info on the Yellowstone area, and Clark at this time was compiling maps for the report of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Coulter collected his payment, finally, from the expedition, and with that and his fur trade profits, he bought a little farm near New Haven, Missouri. He soon married a lady named Sally, and the couple would have one son. However, the quiet life as a farmer would not last. In 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain, and Coulter enlisted. Fighting under Nathan Boone, he died while in service to his country, going down in a blaze of glory, swinging his rifle like a club, killing those damn Englishmen. His final words were, "King George can suck my big, fat American dick. Freedom!" Not really. He did join up to serve, however, it was only for about 65 days. He got sick and died on May 7th, 1812. After his death, his remains were shipped back to Missouri to his wife, who was said to have buried him on a bluff overlooking the Missouri River near New Haven. He was 38 years old, and he blazed the way for what would become the Mountain Man era. It'd be another 10 years before General Ashley's expedition would head west for the beaver-rich rivers. This was the expedition Hugh Glass was on when he got mauled by the bear. The Mountain Man era would span through the 1820s and the 1830s before the beaver trade finally petered out. And to the famous mountain men like Kit Carson and Jim Bridger, John Coulter was a legend. The first American to see such amazing sights, to have braved such harsh conditions alone, to survive seemingly impossible odds many times over again. What a life. I wonder how Coulter felt once he returned to civilization. All the hustle and bustle, the creaks of wagon wheels going down the streets of St. Louis, the crowds of people. He had been so accustomed to the wildlife. The clean, crisp air of the mountains was now replaced with the smell of shit and mud-covered streets. Then he started farming, no longer a free man to range as he pleased, tied to a plow. I wonder if he ever gazed west and thought about the mountains, thought about his previous life as a free trapper, sitting alone near a small fire, feasting on the fat of the land. Who knows, maybe the violence and constant threat of death really did sour him to it. I'm willing to bet, though, had he not fallen sick and died prematurely, he probably would have headed back west again. That's all I've got today on John Coulter. If you want to learn more about him, there's a really cool video on YouTube called Coulter Controversies. It's about an hour-long lecture that really goes in depth on Coulter's travels, as well as the sources behind his birth and death records and how we know what we know about the man. Good stuff. Also check out Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose. It's a really in-depth dive into the Lewis and Clark expedition, and my personal favorite nonfiction book. Also, as a source of research on this episode, I used the book Give Your Heart to the Hawks by Winfield Blevins. It's an older book, but a really good primer on the life and times of the mountain men. Time for some updates and shout-outs. Got a very nice review on iTunes by a guy asking if I do a Bonnie and Clyde episode. Thank you very much for your nice words. It really means a lot. I really appreciate it. I don't think I will do an episode on Bonnie and Clyde, though, just because I'm trying to stick with a Wild West theme, and I think they're a little bit past that era. They're more in the gangster era, driving cars and shooting Tommy guns, shit like that. But what I did think about, however, was maybe doing one on Frank Hammer, the guy that hunted down and ultimately killed Bonnie and Clyde. He too is a little bit out of the time frame I want to stick with, but he was born in the Wild West era. And when he first became a Texas Ranger, they were still operating on horseback and carrying lever-action rifles and single-shot action six-shooters, all that good stuff. So that might be a fun episode to do, kind of see the transformation from a horseback ranger to a motorized gangbuster. So thank you very much for that suggestion. I'd also like to give a shout out to motherfucking Gabe motherfucking Fuentes. Got some good feedback from him on a podcast. Gabe's a pretty cool guy. Seems like a great family man. I think he's got something like 33 kids or some shit. It's either 32 or 33. I got to double check. Rumor has it, I don't know this for a fact, this is just what I heard, that Gabe's got what people these days refer to as big dick energy. Thanks for listening, you bad motherfucker. So I just read 2 books that tie in with some of my previous episodes, as well as this one. The books are Tribe by Sebastian Junger and My Life as an Indian by James Willard Schultz. Sebastian Junger is an author and war correspondent. He also wrote a really good book called War. And if you've ever seen the documentary Restrepo, that's him as well. And in his book Tribe, he talks about how the way we're currently living isn't the way we've lived for the past who knows how many thousands of years. In the first part of his book, he talks about how much different the lives of early Americans were in contrast to those of indigenous tribes. Tribes who were, in fact, living in step with nature, with the natural order of mankind, sort of. And how the lure of tribal native life was strong. He says, quote, "It may say something about human nature that a surprising number of Americans, mostly men, wound up joining Indian society rather than staying with their own. They emulated Indians, married them, were adopted by them, and on some occasions even fought alongside them. And the opposite almost never happened. Indians almost never ran away to join white society. Immigration always seemed to go from the civilized to the tribal. He goes on to point out how Benjamin Franklin once said, quote, "White captives who were liberated from the Indians are almost impossible to keep at home. Though ransomed by their friends and treated with all imagined tenderness to prevail them to stay amongst their English. Yet for a short time they become disgusted with our manner of life and take the first good opportunity of escaping again into the woods." This was such a problem in early America that the Puritans actually tried to criminalize living with the Indians. On the frontier, white men would dress just like the natives in buckskins. They carried tomahawks and learned how to fight from concealment, just like the Indians, unlike the tin soldiers of the English. Younger goes on to write how tribal societies were closer knit. They were smaller groups whose members were largely free to do as they pleased, a communal type of life as opposed to our isolated lives now. We go around all day surrounded by strangers. I don't even know my neighbors' names. We don't have a great cause to unite around, and as a result, things like suicide and depression have actually increased over the years, even though we have easier, more technologically advanced lives than we've ever had. I don't want to talk about the book too much, but I do find it interesting that there's such a draw to a wild life, a free life. And I'm not trying to glamorize the ancient Native American way of life. They suffered a lot. There were starving times, disease, a lot of fucking warfare. But at the same time, they weren't tethered to a time clock. They didn't have to work all day just to pay bills or to just find a little bit of relief during the weekend. Thomas Paine once wrote, "Whether that state that is proudly, perhaps erroneously, called civilization has promoted or most injured the general happiness of man is a question that may be strongly contested. On one side, the spectator is dazzled by splendid appearances. On the other, he is shocked by extremes of wretchedness, both of which it has erected. The most affluent and the most miserable of the human race are to be found in countries that are called civilized." And all of these tribes I've talked about so far on my podcast had to be forced to become civilized. Why? Why didn't they just voluntarily embrace the modern life and shed the teepee for the log cabin? Why did they prefer the hunter-gatherer lifestyle over that of a farmer? Why did these mountain men like John Coulter and like the many that came after him prefer that wild life? These mountain men became more Indian than white in the end. They assimilated into the native cultures. They married into it. And what about all the white captives like Quanah Parker's mother, Cynthia Ann, who did not want to come back to civilization? What is it in us that makes us want to be more free and more wild? A lot of that is covered in Tribe. Highly recommend it. The other book I read, My Life as an Indian, is also a nonfiction, and the author James Schultz recounts his time spent living with the Blackfeet Tribe that we've already mentioned more than a few times on this episode. Schultz's book takes place, 60-something years after Coulter's clash with the Blackfeet. The tribe was no longer the powerhouse they once were, having been devastated by the white man's diseases. He came to live with them as a trader in the late 1870s and ended up becoming what was known as a squaw man. He married into the tribe, he learned their language and their culture. He even went out on a few war parties with him against their traditional enemies, such as the Crow, who we also mentioned earlier in this episode. It's a beautiful book, and it gives more of a human aspect to these tribes. Like I said in a previous episode, history is written by the victors, and almost everything I've read about the Blackfeet is negative. Lewis and Clark had issues with them. They almost killed Coulter several times. The mountain men and trappers fucking hated the Blackfeet, nicknaming the tribe Bugs Boys or the Devil's Children. But if you read Schultz, you see, they fought their enemies, but these, quote, savages were more like us than you think. He really shines a light on their charity towards each other, their sense of community, and all-around well-being of their bands. There's a funny story in the book about how he was talking in his sleep, not in the Blackfeet language, but in English. So his wife got pissed, assuming that since he was talking in English, he was talking to a white woman who had crept into his dreams. Another funny anecdote, his wife couldn't read, but she still studied over the letters he'd received from family back east. And soon enough, she learned how to tell which letters were written by women, as opposed to men. And she'd get a little jealous then as well, wanting to know what these fucking women are writing to him about. It's just a really great book and humanizes the Blackfeet, as well as all Native people. You see just how similar we are. We may dress differently, we may speak different languages, but people are people. Anyway, Schultz also talks about the appeal of the wild life. In chapter 6 of his book, he writes, "Alas, why could not this simple life have continued? Why must the railroads and the swarms of settlers have invaded that wonderful land and robbed its lords of all that made it worth living? They knew not care, nor hunger, nor want of any kind. From my window I hear the roar of the great city and see the crowds hurtling by. The day is bitterly cold, yet the majority of the passer-by, women as well as men, are thinly clad, and their faces are thin, and their eyes express sad thoughts. Many of them have no warm shelter from the storm, know not where to get a little food, although they would gladly work for it with all of their strength. They are bound to the wheel, and there is no escape from it except by death. And this is civilization. I, for one, maintain that there is no satisfaction, no happiness in it. The Indians of the plains back in those days of which I write alone knew what was perfect contentness and happiness. And that, we are told, is the chief aim and end of men. To be free from want and worry and care. Civilization will never furnish it, except to a very, very few. Damn. I think it's so amazing that these two men, Schultz and Younger, came to the same conclusion, both writing their thoughts more than 100 years apart. Both having survived wild, extreme conditions, and both finding the security of civilization with its overabundance and indulgence lacking. So I keep asking, what is it? What was it about these simpler, happier, yet more uncertain and deadlier times? What made the white man flee civilization and live amongst the Stone Age? What made John Coulter turn back into the wild so many times? I don't know. Fuck it. Just food for thought. Something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I wonder what I can do personally to make my life a little bit more simpler. So anyway, my next episode I'm really excited about. It's going to be about the murderous Glanton gang. John Joel Glanton was an early settler of Texas. He fought for Texas independence and then went mercenary, eventually leading a gang of scalp hunters to wreak carnage on the frontier. The great book Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy is loosely based on this gang. So that's going to be the next episode. As always, please rate and review Bloody Beaver Podcast on iTunes, and feel free to hit me up at bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com. If you got any criticisms of the show, or maybe there's a topic you'd like to suggest, or you want to tell me how sexy my voice is, or you want to tell me how much you hate me, and how much you want to beat the shit out of me. I'm definitely interested in whatever y'all got to say. Thanks again for listening. If you're out in search of beaver this weekend, stay safe. Take some protection along. If we've learned anything from John Coulter, it's that the pursuit of beaver can be extremely hazardous to one's health.